It is the early hours of November the 5th, 1605. Beneath the House of Lords in Westminster, a man is discovered among 36 barrels of gunpowder. He gives his name as John Johnson. He is carrying slow matches and a pocket watch. Within hours, the authorities will learn his real name, Guy Fawkes, a soldier from York with years of military experience in the Spanish Netherlands. He has been caught in the act of preparing to blow up Parliament, along with King James I and the entire English ruling class, at the state opening the following morning. The plot had been more than 18 months in the making. It was the work of a small group of English Catholics driven by decades of persecution, fines, imprisonment, and the execution of their priests. They had pinned their hopes on James, the son of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, expecting him to ease the burden on their community when he took the English throne in 1603. Instead, he tightened the laws against them. The man behind the conspiracy was Robert Catesby, a charismatic Warwickshire gentleman from one of the most prominent Catholic families in England. Catesby recruited a circle of trusted men, secured a cellar directly beneath the Lord's chamber, and spent months smuggling gunpowder into position. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition and its brutality. If it had succeeded, it would have killed the king, the queen, Prince Henry, most of the nobility, the bishops, and the judges of England in a single explosion. It failed because of a letter. An anonymous warning sent to a Catholic lord 10 days before the planned attack set in motion a chain of events that led to the search of the cellars, the arrest of Fawkes, and the unravelling of the entire conspiracy. Within days, the remaining plotters were either dead or in custody. Within weeks, they faced trial and execution. Over the course of this episode, we will trace the path from Catholic persecution under Elizabeth and James to the formation of the plot, the identities and motivations of the 13 conspirators, the critical mistake that exposed them, the violent final stand at Holbeach House, and the aftermath that shaped English law and memory for centuries. Part 1. A Kingdom Divided. When Henry VIII broke with Rome in 1534, he set England on a path that would divide its people for generations. The break was political in origin, driven by Henry's desire for an annulment that the Pope refused to grant, but its consequences reached into every parish, every household, and every conscience in the kingdom. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized and redistributed. The English Bible replaced the Latin Mass. Catholic worship, which had been the only form of Christianity in England for nearly 1,000 years, was pushed to the margins. Under Henry's son, Edward VI, the Protestant Reformation accelerated. Under Mary I, it reversed. Mary restored papal authority, reinstated the Mass, and burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake in a campaign that earned her the name Bloody Mary. When she died in 1558 and her half-sister Elizabeth took the throne, England swung back to Protestantism, and this time the swing proved permanent. Elizabeth's religious settlement of 1559 established the Church of England as the state church and made the monarch its supreme governor. Attendance at Anglican services on Sundays and holy days became a legal requirement. Catholics who refused to attend, known as recusants, faced fines of 12 pence per absence at first, a sum that was annoying but manageable. The early years of Elizabeth's reign were relatively tolerant. Many Catholics attended the Anglican service outwardly while practicing their faith in private, and the government largely looked the other way. That changed in 1570. Pope Pius V issued a papal bull called Regnans in Excelsis, which declared Elizabeth a heretic and excommunicated her. More dangerously, it released her Catholic subjects from any obligation of loyalty to her and effectively invited them to depose her. The bull transformed the position of English Catholics overnight. Where they had been subjects with an inconvenient faith, they were now potential traitors by definition. Elizabeth's government responded with increasingly harsh legislation. In 1571, it became treason to call the Queen a heretic or to introduce papal bulls into the country. In 1581, the fines for recusancy were raised from 12 pence to £20 per month, a sum that could ruin a gentleman's estate within a few years. It also became treason to convert anyone to Catholicism or to be converted. In 1585, the Act against Jesuits and seminary priests made it a capital offence simply to be a Catholic priest in England. Any priest ordained abroad who set foot on English soil could be arrested, tried, and executed for treason, regardless of whether he had engaged in any political activity at all. The government backed these laws with an extensive intelligence network. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's principal secretary and spymaster, ran a web of agents and informers that infiltrated Catholic circles both in England and on the continent. Walsingham was a convinced Protestant who viewed Catholicism as an existential threat to the English state, and he pursued Catholic conspirators with a ruthless patience that made him feared across Europe. His agents operated in the English seminaries in Douai and Rome, identifying young men training for the priesthood before they ever set foot back in England. He intercepted correspondence, turned informers within Catholic households, and built cases that could send men to the scaffold on the strength of a decoded letter. Walsingham's network uncovered a series of genuine plots against Elizabeth. The Throckmorton Plot of 1583 aimed to free Mary, Queen of Scots, and place her on the English throne with the backing of a Spanish invasion force. Francis Throckmorton, a young Catholic gentleman, served as the intermediary between Mary and the Spanish ambassador Bernardino de Mendoza. Under torture in the Tower, Throckmorton confessed and was executed. Mendoza was expelled from England. 3 years later came the Babington Plot, which proved fatal for Mary herself. Anthony Babington, a wealthy young Catholic from Derbyshire, corresponded with Mary about a plan to assassinate Elizabeth, liberate Mary from her long imprisonment, and trigger a Catholic uprising supported by foreign troops. Walsingham's agents had penetrated the conspiracy from the start. They intercepted the letters, allowed the plot to develop until Mary had committed herself in writing, and then struck. Babington and his fellow conspirators were executed in September 1586. Mary, Queen of Scots, was tried at Fotheringhay Castle that October and beheaded the following February. Each failed conspiracy brought fresh reprisals against the broader Catholic community, including those who had taken no part in any plot. The recusancy fines drained family wealth across generations. Catholic children were barred from attending the universities at Oxford and Cambridge. Catholics could hold no public office, serve on no jury, and practice no profession that required an oath of supremacy. Marriages performed by Catholic priests carried no legal standing. Informers were rewarded for turning in their neighbours, and the threat of betrayal hung over every gathering where Mass was celebrated. Priests moved in secret from house to house, arriving after dark and celebrating Mass in hidden rooms built into the walls and chimneys of Catholic manor houses. These priest holes, as they became known, were feats of ingenuity. Some were concealed behind fireplaces, others built into staircases or the thick walls of Tudor chimneys with trapdoors disguised by wooden panelling. The most skilled builder of these hiding places was Nicholas Owen, a Jesuit lay brother and carpenter who spent more than 18 years constructing priest holes across the English countryside. Owen was a small man, physically slight, who had suffered a hernia from years of heavy labour, yet he worked alone or with a single assistant to preserve secrecy, often building at night and disposing of the excavated materials himself. He constructed hiding places at Hindlip Hall in Worcestershire, Harvington Hall in the same county, and Baddesley Clinton in Warwickshire, among many others. Some of his constructions were so well concealed that government search parties could spend days tearing a house apart and still fail to find them. Owen would later be captured in January 1606 in the aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot itself. He was taken to the Tower of London and subjected to prolonged torture on the rack. He died under interrogation in March of that year, having revealed nothing. Between 1577 and 1603, more than 130 Catholic priests and laypeople were executed in England. Many were hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn, the execution site near what is now Marble Arch in London. The process was deliberately gruesome. The condemned man was dragged on a hurdle through the streets, hanged until partially conscious, cut down, and then disemboweled and dismembered while still alive. Others died in prison, from disease and neglect, their deaths recorded with less ceremony, but equal finality. Among the executed were Edmund Campion, a brilliant Jesuit scholar who had been one of the most gifted students of his generation at Oxford before his conversion. Campion returned to England in 1580 on a covert mission to minister to the Catholic faithful, travelling in disguise, preaching in secret, and distributing a pamphlet known as Campion's Brag that challenged the Protestant establishment to a public debate. He was captured in 1581, tortured repeatedly, and executed at Tyburn that December alongside 2 other priests. His death made him a martyr in Catholic eyes and hardened the resolve of those who remained. The community that survived did so through a combination of outward conformity, secrecy, and sheer endurance. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, English Catholics were diminished in numbers, scattered, and desperate for relief. Their faith had been kept alive largely by the gentry families of the Midlands and the North, families like the Throckmortons, the Treshams, the Winters, and the Catesbys, who had the resources to harbour priests, pay the fines, and absorb the social penalties that came with open recusancy. These families intermarried, forming a tight Catholic network bound by blood, faith, and shared suffering. Several of their sons would shortly find themselves drawn into the most audacious conspiracy in English history. When Elizabeth died on March the 24th, 1603, the Catholic community allowed itself to hope. James VI of Scotland, who now became James I of England, was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic martyr whose execution still haunted the community's memory. His wife, Anne of Denmark, had converted to Catholicism. James himself had made private assurances to Catholic nobles, communicated through intermediaries like Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, that he would ease the penal laws once he took the English throne. Catholic expectations soared. Some families began openly celebrating Mass again, confident that the new reign would bring toleration. Recusancy fines went briefly uncollected as local officials waited to see which way the political wind would blow. The disappointment came quickly. James was a Protestant king raised by strict Scottish Presbyterians, and whatever private sympathy he may have felt toward individual Catholics, he had no intention of risking his new throne by alienating the Protestant establishment that had welcomed his succession. The man who held the real levers of power in the new government was Robert Cecil, Secretary of State. Cecil was the son of Lord Burghley, who had served Elizabeth for decades, and he had inherited his father's political instincts along with his deep suspicion of Catholic loyalty. Cecil was physically small, with a hunched back that his enemies mocked, but he was among the most capable political operators in English history. He had managed the delicate negotiations that brought James peacefully to the English throne, and he intended to maintain the religious settlement that kept the Protestant establishment secure and himself in power. At the Hampton Court Conference in January 1604, James made it clear that he would uphold the established church. By February, he had ordered all Catholic priests to leave the country within days or face the full penalties of the law. The recusancy fines, which had been relaxed during the early months of the new reign, were reinstated and collected with renewed vigour. In some counties, pursuivants, the officials who enforced the recusancy laws, arrived at Catholic homes with fresh warrants and fresh energy. For Catholic families who had staked everything on the hope of a tolerant king, this felt like the final door closing. The legal framework that had squeezed them for decades remained in place, and the new king, who they believed would dismantle it, had instead reinforced it. It was in this atmosphere of crushed expectation and deepening anger that a Warwickshire gentleman named Robert Catesby began to consider a different kind of solution. Part 2. The Men Behind the Plot. Robert Catesby was 31 years old in 1604, tall, handsome, and possessed of a personal magnetism that contemporaries found difficult to resist. He came from one of the oldest Catholic families in Warwickshire. His father, Sir William Catesby, had been imprisoned multiple times for harbouring priests and had paid recusancy fines so heavy that the family estate at Lapworth had been severely diminished. Robert had been educated at Oxford but left without a degree, as was common for Catholic students who refused to take the oath of supremacy required for graduation. He married young to a Protestant woman named Catherine Lay, and for a time it seemed he might settle into the life of a country gentleman, managing what remained of his inheritance. His wife died in 1598, and their surviving son, also named Robert, was raised Catholic. Catesby's path toward conspiracy began with the Essex Rebellion of 1601. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, had been Elizabeth's favourite before falling from grace, and in February of that year he led a reckless attempt to seize the Queen and remove her advisers. Catesby joined the rising, though his precise role remains unclear. The rebellion collapsed within a day. Essex was executed. Catesby was wounded in the fighting, captured and imprisoned. He avoided execution but was fined a crippling 4,000 marks for his part in the affair, a sum that forced him to sell Lapworth, the family seat his ancestors had held for generations. The experience transformed him. He emerged from prison more radical, more reckless, and convinced that conventional political action would achieve nothing for English Catholics. By the autumn of 1603, with James's promises of toleration already broken, Catesby had conceived the outline of a plan. He would destroy the king, the lords, and the commons in a single strike by detonating gunpowder beneath Parliament during the state opening. In the chaos that followed, Catholic sympathisers would seize the king's young daughter, Princess Elizabeth, who was being raised at Combe Abbey in Warwickshire, and install her as a puppet queen under Catholic guardianship. It was a plan of extraordinary ambition, and Catesby pursued it with a conviction that bordered on fanaticism. The first man Catesby confided in was his cousin Thomas Winter, a scholar and linguist from Worcestershire who spoke several languages and had contacts on the continent. Winter had already travelled to Spain on behalf of the English Catholic community, attempting to persuade the Spanish court to intervene in England, or at least to pressure James into granting toleration. He returned empty-handed. The Spanish had signed a peace treaty with England in August 1604 and had no appetite for a fresh conflict. When Catesby laid out his plan, Winter was initially horrified. He later recalled that he argued against it, calling it a course of action that would bring ruin on the entire Catholic community if it failed. Catesby was unmoved. He told Winter that the nature of the disease required so sharp a remedy and that the plan would proceed with or without him. Winter agreed to join. Catesby then recruited John Wright, a tall, powerfully built Yorkshireman who was reputed to be one of the finest swordsmen in England. Wright and Catesby had been friends since childhood, and Wright's Catholic convictions were as deep as Catesby's own. He had been involved in the Essex Rebellion alongside Catesby and had spent time imprisoned for his recusancy. Wright was a man of action rather than words, and he committed to the plot without hesitation. The fourth member of the original conspiracy was Thomas Percy, a distant relative of Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland. Percy was older than the others, in his mid-40s, with a white beard and a fierce temperament. He served as the Earl's agent in the north, managing his estates and collecting rents, a position that gave him both income and social standing. Percy had been among those who carried messages between the Catholic community and James before his accession, and he felt the king's betrayal of his promises with a particular bitterness. He had a violent streak. There were allegations that he had mistreated tenants on the Northumberland estates and that his accounting of the Earl's rents was less than honest. When Catesby told him the plan, Percy responded with characteristic bluntness, declaring that he was ready to kill the king with his own hands if necessary. Catesby calmed him and explained that the gunpowder scheme would accomplish far more than a single assassination. Percy's recruitment brought a practical advantage. Through his connection to the Earl of Northumberland, Percy was able to secure a lease on a property adjacent to the House of Lords in Westminster. The building, part of a row of lodgings near the old Palace of Westminster, gave the conspirators a base of operations within yards of their target. Percy took the lease in his own name, posing as a gentleman who needed London lodgings for when he attended to business in the capital. The fifth and final member of the original group was the man who would become the most famous of them all. Guy Fawkes was a Yorkshireman, born in 1570 in Stonegate, in the city of York. His father, Edward Fawkes, was a proctor of the ecclesiastical courts and a Protestant. His mother, Edith, came from a prominent Catholic family, the Jacksons of Scotland. When Guy was 8 years old, his father died. His mother remarried a Catholic man named Dennis Bainbridge, and the young Fawkes was raised in a Catholic household from that point on. He was educated at St. Peter's School in York, where his classmates included John and Christopher Wright, the brothers who would later join the plot. Fawkes left England in 1593 at the age of 23 to fight in the Spanish army of Flanders. The war in the Low Countries, where Spain was battling to suppress the Protestant Dutch revolt, drew Catholic volunteers from across Europe, and Fawkes served with distinction for more than a decade. He fought at the Siege of Calais in 1596 and was present at the capture of the city from the French. He rose to a position of some responsibility, and Spanish military records refer to him as a man of great piety and exemplary conduct. During his years on the continent, Fawkes adopted the Italian version of his first name, styling himself Guido, and developed an expertise in the use of gunpowder and mining operations that would prove central to the conspiracy. In 1603, Fawkes travelled to Spain to petition King Philip III directly, urging a Spanish invasion of England to restore Catholicism. The petition went nowhere. It was during this period that Thomas Winter, on his own mission to the Spanish court, encountered Fawkes and recognized his potential value. Winter introduced Fawkes to Catesby in England, and the group held its founding meeting at the Duck and Drake Inn on the Strand in London in May 1604. The 5 men, Catesby, Winter, Wright, Percy and Fawkes, swore an oath of secrecy on a prayer book. They then heard Mass together in an adjoining room, administered by Father John Gerard, a Jesuit priest, though Gerard would later insist that he had no knowledge of the oath or the conspiracy. Over the following months, the plotters began their preparations. Fawkes, using the alias John Johnson, posed as Percy's servant and took up residence in the lodgings near the House of Lords. The original plan involved digging a tunnel from their rented property beneath the foundations of the Lord's Chamber, and the conspirators spent weeks in late 1604 and early 1605 engaged in backbreaking excavation work. The ground beneath Westminster was heavy with medieval rubble and waterlogged soil, and progress was painfully slow. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and carried the constant risk of discovery. A stroke of luck changed everything. In March 1605, the conspirators learned that a ground-floor cellar directly beneath the House of Lords had become available for lease. The cellar belonged to a coal merchant named Ellen Bright and was used for storing fuel. Percy secured the lease, again using his connection to the Earl of Northumberland to smooth the arrangement. The tunnel was abandoned, and the conspirators began the work of moving gunpowder into the cellar instead. The gunpowder was acquired in stages and stored initially at a house in Lambeth on the south bank of the Thames, before being ferried across the river by boat and carried into the cellar. 36 barrels in total, approximately 1,800 pounds of powder, were stacked in the cellar and concealed beneath bundles of firewood and iron bars. Fawkes oversaw the storage and arrangement. His years of military experience made him the only member of the group who truly understood the material they were handling, and he calculated that the quantity would be more than sufficient to demolish the building above and kill everyone inside. As the plot grew closer to execution, Catesby expanded the circle of conspirators. Robert Keyes, a dependable Catholic gentleman who had been entrusted with the key to the Lambeth storage house, was brought in. So was Catesby's cousin Robert Winter, Thomas Winter's elder brother, who provided financial support and the use of his house at Huddington Court in Worcestershire as a gathering point. Thomas Bates, Catesby's personal servant, was admitted after he became suspicious of his master's activities. Catesby told him the plan and bound him to secrecy. The later recruits brought wealth and resources. Sir Everard Digby was a young, wealthy Catholic landowner from Rutland who had recently been knighted by James himself. Digby was charming and well-connected, and Catesby assigned him a specific role in the aftermath of the explosion. He was to ride to Combe Abbey, seize Princess Elizabeth, and present her as the new queen. Ambrose Rookwood, a Suffolk gentleman with a passion for fine horses, provided the fast mounts that would be needed for escape and for the ride to the Midlands. John Grant, who held the manor at Norbrook near Stratford-upon-Avon, offered his property as an arms store. The 13th and final conspirator was Francis Tresham, and his recruitment would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. Tresham was the son of Sir Thomas Tresham, one of the most prominent Catholic gentlemen in England, who had spent years in prison for his faith and had poured his fortune into building the extraordinary triangular lodge at Rushton in Northamptonshire, a building whose every dimension encoded references to the Holy Trinity. Francis had inherited a substantial estate on his father's death in 1605, and Catesby wanted his money. Tresham was reluctant. He raised objections, asked difficult questions, and urged Catesby to consider whether Catholic peers who would be present at the state opening might be warned in advance. Catesby refused, insisting that a few individual casualties among Catholic lords were an acceptable price. Tresham was eventually brought into the conspiracy, but his discomfort would have consequences that none of them foresaw. By the late summer of 1605, the gunpowder was in place, the cellar was secured, and the conspirators had dispersed to their estates to await the state opening of Parliament. Fawkes remained in London, checking on the cellar periodically to ensure the gunpowder had not been disturbed or degraded by damp. The opening had originally been scheduled for February 1605, but had been postponed first to October and then to November the 5th due to concerns about plague in the capital. Each delay tested the conspirators' nerves, but also gave them additional time to refine their plans for the aftermath. Everything depended on secrecy, and secrecy depended on the discipline of 13 men, some of whom had families, servants, and Catholic friends who would be sitting in the very chamber they planned to destroy. Part 3. The Monteagle Letter. On the evening of Saturday, October the 26th, 1605, 10 days before the state opening of Parliament, William Parker, the 4th Baron Monteagle, sat down to supper at his house in Hoxton, on the northern outskirts of London. Monteagle was a Catholic peer, 30 years old, who had navigated the difficult terrain of Jacobean politics with care. He had been involved in the Essex Rebellion as a young man and had been imprisoned for it, but he had since reconciled himself to the new regime, paid his fines, and cultivated a relationship with Robert Cecil. He occupied the uncomfortable middle ground that many Catholic nobles found themselves in, loyal to the crown in practice while remaining Catholic in faith. During a meal, a servant arrived with a letter. It had been delivered to the door by a stranger, a tall man, whose face the servant could not clearly make out in the dark. The letter was unsigned, undated, and written in a disguised hand. Monteagle did not read it himself. Instead, he asked a member of his household, Thomas Ward, to read it aloud. The letter's language was urgent but oblique. It warned Monteagle to stay away from the opening of Parliament and to make some excuse for his absence. It spoke of a terrible blow that would be delivered and urged him to retire to the country where he might expect the event in safety. The letter advised Monteagle to burn it after reading. Monteagle did the opposite. Rather than destroying the letter or keeping it to himself, he immediately took it to Robert Cecil at Whitehall. This decision has been debated by historians for 4 centuries. Some have taken it at face value, as the act of a loyal subject alarmed by a credible threat. Others have argued that Monteagle's response was suspiciously swift, that he seemed to have been expecting the letter, and that the entire episode may have been orchestrated in coordination with Cecil to provide a pretext for uncovering a plot that the government already knew about. Cecil received the letter and, according to his own later account, decided to wait before acting. He did not immediately show it to the king. James was away from London on a hunting trip at Royston in Hertfordshire, and Cecil later claimed that he wanted to present the matter to the king in person rather than by messenger. He also said he wanted to see whether any further intelligence would emerge in the intervening days. This delay, too, has attracted suspicion. If the threat was genuine and Cecil believed it, waiting nearly a week to act seems reckless. If, on the other hand, Cecil already had knowledge of the conspiracy through his own intelligence network, the delay could be explained as careful stage management, allowing events to unfold in a way that would produce maximum dramatic effect and maximum political advantage. The question of how much Cecil knew and when remains one of the enduring mysteries of the Gunpowder Plot. Cecil maintained an extensive network of spies and informers, inherited and expanded from Walsingham's operation. He had agents inside the Catholic community and contacts on the continent who reported on the movements and conversations of English Catholic exiles. It is plausible, some historians have argued, that Cecil had received intelligence about a conspiracy months before the Monteagle letter arrived, and that he allowed it to develop to the point of near execution so that its discovery would justify the harshest possible crackdown on English Catholicism. There is no definitive proof of this theory, but the circumstantial evidence has sustained it for centuries. What is certain is that the letter's arrival sent shockwaves through the conspiracy. Thomas Ward, the man who had read the letter aloud at Monteagle's table, was himself connected to the Catholic underground. Ward sent word to Catesby, through intermediaries, that Monteagle had received a warning and had taken it directly to Cecil. The conspirators were thrown into crisis. Some urged Catesby to abandon the plot immediately. Thomas Winter and John Wright argued that the letter might be specific enough to lead the authorities to the cellar. Catesby refused to retreat. He pointed out that the letter named no names, described no mechanism, and could be interpreted as referring to any number of potential threats. He argued that the government would likely dismiss it as a hoax or a general warning. If they checked the cellar at all, Fawkes would simply present himself as Percy's servant, guarding his master's store of firewood and fuel. Catesby's confidence held the group together, though several of the conspirators were now deeply uneasy. The prime suspect for the authorship of the letter has always been Francis Tresham. Monteagle was Tresham's brother-in-law, married to Tresham's sister, Elizabeth. Tresham had been the most reluctant of the conspirators from the moment he was recruited, and he had specifically raised the question of whether Catholic lords in the chamber could be warned. He had the motive, the family connection, and the opportunity. Several of the conspirators suspected him immediately. When Catesby confronted Tresham directly, Tresham denied writing the letter and swore his continued loyalty to the conspiracy. He pointed out that if he had wanted to betray the plot, he could have gone to the authorities himself rather than sending an anonymous letter that named nobody and described nothing specific. Catesby appears to have accepted the denial, or at least decided that there was insufficient proof to act on his suspicions. Thomas Winter later claimed that he urged Catesby to kill Tresham as a precaution, but Catesby declined, perhaps reluctant to murder a kinsman, perhaps hoping that Tresham's money would still be needed for the Catholic rising that was supposed to follow the explosion. Other candidates for the letter's authorship have been proposed. Some historians have suggested that Monteagle himself arranged for the letter to be sent as a way of positioning himself as the man who saved Parliament while simultaneously protecting his Catholic relatives from the consequences of the plot. Others have pointed to Cecil himself, arguing that the letter was a fabrication designed to provide a plausible, public reason for a search that Cecil had already decided to carry out based on intelligence gathered through other channels. The handwriting of the letter has been analysed repeatedly over the centuries, and while some scholars have noted similarities to Tresham's hand, the evidence remains inconclusive. In the days between the letter's delivery and the king's return to London, the conspirators watched and waited. Catesby sent Fawkes to check the cellar. Fawkes reported that the gunpowder was undisturbed, the firewood and iron bars still stacked exactly as he had left them. There was no sign that anyone had searched the premises. This reassured Catesby, who took the lack of action as proof that the government had dismissed the letter. He told his fellow conspirators that they would proceed as planned. King James returned to London at the end of October. Cecil showed him the letter on Friday, November the 1st. James, who prided himself on his intellect and his ability to interpret hidden meanings, seized on the phrase about a terrible blow and concluded that it referred to gunpowder. Whether this insight was genuinely the king's own, or whether Cecil guided him toward it, is another point of contention. Cecil had already ordered discreet inquiries about the cellars beneath Parliament, and he may well have known what would be found there before the king ever saw the letter. The decision was taken to wait until the last possible moment before searching, so as to catch whoever was responsible in the act and leave no room for denial. The first search of the buildings around the House of Lords was conducted on the afternoon of Monday, November the 4th, by Thomas Howard, the Earl of Suffolk, who served as Lord Chamberlain. Suffolk walked through the undercroft and adjoining cellars on the pretext of checking arrangements for the state opening. In the cellar beneath the Lord's chamber, he found a large quantity of firewood and bundles of sticks, known as faggots, stacked against the walls. He also encountered a tall, powerfully built man who identified himself as John Johnson, a servant of Thomas Percy. Johnson explained that the firewood belonged to his master, who kept it there for heating his nearby lodgings. Suffolk later reported that the quantity of fuel seemed excessive for any private household, but Johnson's manner was calm and his explanation plausible. Suffolk withdrew without searching beneath the stacked wood. He reported back to Cecil and the king, noting both the fuel and the name of Percy. That evening, the Privy Council debated how to proceed. James ordered a second, more thorough search. Shortly before midnight on the night of November the 4th, a party led by Sir Thomas Knivet, a Westminster magistrate and a trusted member of the royal household, returned to the cellar. Knivet was a practical, decisive man, and he had brought armed men with him. They found Fawkes in the cellar, fully dressed in a cloak and hat, with boots and spurs as if ready to ride. He was carrying a lantern, a pocket watch, and slow matches, the lengths of treated cord used to ignite gunpowder. When the firewood and faggots were pulled aside, the search party discovered the 36 barrels of gunpowder concealed beneath them. Fawkes was seized immediately. He offered no resistance. According to the account later given by Knivet, Fawkes was calm and composed at the moment of his arrest, showing no fear and making no attempt to flee. When asked what he intended to do with so much gunpowder, Fawkes replied that his purpose was to blow the king and the Scottish beggars who had come with him back to Scotland. It was a remark of striking defiance, aimed at the Scottish courtiers who had followed James south and whom many English subjects, Catholic and Protestant alike, resented for their influence at court. Fawkes was taken under guard to the King's bedchamber in Whitehall, where he was questioned before James and several members of the Privy Council in the early hours of November the 5th. He gave his name as John Johnson and refused to identify his associates. He admitted freely that he had intended to destroy Parliament and said he regretted only that he had failed. James, by the account of those present, was struck by the man's composure and is reported to have said that Fawkes possessed a Roman resolution. The king then signed a warrant authorizing the use of torture to extract the names of his fellow conspirators. Fawkes was taken to the Tower of London. Word of the arrest spread through London by dawn. Church bells rang out across the city and bonfires were lit in the streets in celebration of the king's deliverance. Londoners gathered in the streets, exchanging the news with a mixture of relief and outrage. The scale of what had been prevented began to sink in. If the gunpowder had been detonated, the explosion would have destroyed the House of Lords and much of the surrounding palace complex, killing the king, the queen, Prince Henry, the lords spiritual and temporal, the judges, and the assembled commons. It would have been the single most devastating act of political violence in English history. Meanwhile, in the Midlands, the remaining conspirators were already in motion. Catesby had received word of Fawkes's arrest during the night, carried to him by a rider who had left London at speed. He knew the plot had failed and that it was only a matter of time before Fawkes broke under interrogation and revealed every name. Catesby gathered those conspirators who were with him in the Midlands, and he rode north with no intention of surrendering. Part 4. The Hunting of the Conspirators. In the Tower of London, Guy Fawkes held out longer than anyone expected. On the morning of November the 5th, he was questioned by members of the Privy Council, including Cecil himself. Fawkes remained defiant, giving only his alias of John Johnson and refusing to name any of his associates. He freely admitted his intention to destroy Parliament and expressed no remorse. The councillors pressed him for details of the conspiracy, but he volunteered nothing beyond what was already obvious from his capture. James had authorized the use of torture, specifying that it should begin with gentler methods and escalate by degrees to the worst, which meant the rack. The rack was the Tower's most feared instrument. The prisoner was laid on a wooden frame, his wrists and ankles bound to rollers at either end, and the rollers were turned to stretch the body until the joints dislocated. It was reserved for cases involving treason and required a royal warrant for its use. The lieutenant of the Tower, Sir William Wade, oversaw the interrogation. Wade was a veteran of Elizabethan intelligence work, a hard, methodical man who had served under both Walsingham and Cecil and who understood the art of breaking a prisoner's resistance. The physical evidence of what Fawkes endured survives in a remarkable document. His signature on his first confession, taken before the torture began, is firm and clearly written. His signature on the confession, extracted after several days on the rack, is barely legible, a shaking, fragmented scrawl that trails off the page. The contrast between the two signatures tells its own story. Over the course of several days, Fawkes gave up the names one by one. He identified Catesby as the leader, named Thomas Winter, Thomas Percy, John Wright, and the rest of the conspirators, and described the planning and logistics of the plot in detail. By the time he had finished, the government had a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy, yet events in the Midlands had already taken their own violent course. Catesby had left London on the evening of November the 4th, several hours before Fawkes was discovered in the cellar. Whether Catesby departed because he sensed the plot was about to unravel, or simply because his role had always been to lead the second phase of the conspiracy from the Midlands, is unclear. He rode north with John Wright and Wright's brother Christopher, along with Thomas Percy and Thomas Bates. They travelled at speed along the road through Northamptonshire, changing horses where they could at Catholic safe houses along the route. Their destination was Warwickshire, where Catesby hoped to raise a Catholic rebellion. The plan had always included a second phase after the explosion, the seizure of Princess Elizabeth from Combe Abbey, where the 9-year-old princess was being raised under the guardianship of Lord Harrington, and the proclamation of a new Catholic government with Elizabeth as a figurehead queen. Catesby clung to this plan even after the Gunpowder Plot itself had failed. He believed, or needed to believe, that the Catholic gentry of the Midlands would rally to his cause once they heard the news. It was the same force of will that had sustained the conspiracy for 18 months, but now it was detached from any realistic prospect of success. The group rode through the night, covering nearly 80 miles in a single journey, changing horses at sympathetic Catholic houses along the way. They reached Ashby St Ledgers, the Catesby family home in Northamptonshire, by the early hours of November the 5th. From there they pressed on to Dunchurch in Warwickshire, where Sir Everard Digby was waiting. Digby had gathered a group of Catholic gentlemen at Dunchurch under the pretext of a hunting party, assembling the men and horses that were supposed to form the nucleus of the rising. When Catesby arrived and told Digby that the plot had been discovered, Digby was devastated. He had staked his fortune and his life on the conspiracy, and he now faced ruin. Digby urged Catesby to flee the country, but Catesby refused. Instead, Catesby rallied what support he could. He told the assembled men that a blow had been struck for the Catholic faith and that they must ride to gather arms and supporters. The response was dismaying. Most of the gentlemen at Dunchurch, who had come expecting a day's hunting, melted away when they understood what was being asked of them. They had families, estates, and lives to protect, and they saw no future in joining an armed rebellion that had already lost its central purpose. Catesby was left with a hard core of around 30 men, most of them the original conspirators and their immediate servants. The group rode west through Warwickshire, a bedraggled column of mounted men growing more desperate with each mile. At John Grant's house at Norbrook, near Stratford-upon-Avon, they collected weapons and armour that had been stored there in preparation for the rising: swords, pistols, crossbows, and what gunpowder Grant had been able to accumulate. They moved on to Huntington Court, the home of Robert Winter, where they rested briefly and attempted to recruit more men. At Huntington, Father Nicholas Hart and Father Oswald Tessimond, two Jesuit priests who had been moving through the Catholic underground, briefly crossed paths with the fugitives. The priests heard what had happened and quickly departed, recognizing that association with the conspirators meant death. Tessimond would eventually escape to the continent disguised as a sailor, making it to the Spanish Netherlands and later to Rome, where he lived out his days and wrote an account of the plot. The response from the Catholic community was the same everywhere the conspirators turned. Families they approached were horrified by what they heard. The plot had failed, the government knew their names, and anyone who joined them now would be riding towards certain death. The Earl of Northumberland, Percy's patron, made no move to assist them. Local Catholic gentlemen barred their doors. One by one, men who might otherwise have offered shelter turned them away. The weather turned against them as well. Heavy rain had set in across the Midlands, soaking the riders and their horses and turning the roads to mud. The gunpowder they carried with them, taken from the stores at Norbrook and Huntington, was damp and of questionable use. The group was shrinking as servants and hangers-on slipped away into the countryside. By the evening of November the 7th, Catesby and his remaining followers had reached Holbeach House in Staffordshire, the home of Stephen Littleton, a Catholic gentleman who had reluctantly agreed to shelter them. At Holbeach, the conspirators' situation became desperate. They were exhausted, wet, and running low on supplies. They attempted to dry their damp gunpowder by spreading it on a plate before the fire. What happened next had a grim irony that was lost on none of them. A spark from the fire ignited the gunpowder, and the resulting explosion tore through the room. John Grant was blinded by the flash, his face and eyes badly burned. Ambrose Rookwood was severely injured. Catesby himself was scorched, but remained on his feet. The men who had planned to destroy the English government with gunpowder had now been wounded by the same substance. The accident broke the spirit of several of the remaining conspirators. Thomas Bates, Catesby's servant, fled into the night. Robert Winter and Stephen Littleton escaped together, hoping to reach the Welsh border. They would survive as fugitives for 2 months before being captured in January 1606, found hiding in a barn near Hagley in Worcestershire, half-starved and dressed in rags. Those who stayed at Holbeach House prepared for a final stand. Catesby, Thomas Percy, John Wright, Christopher Wright, and Ambrose Rookwood resolved to fight rather than submit to capture, trial, and the horrors of a traitor's execution. They barricaded the doors and waited through the night with what arms they had. The Sheriff of Worcestershire, Sir Richard Walsh, arrived at Holbeach House on the morning of November the 8th with a company of around 200 armed men. Walsh had been tracking the conspirators westward through the Midlands for 2 days, gathering reinforcements from the local militias and trained bands as he went. He had received reports of the fugitives' movements from villagers and innkeepers along the route, and by the time he reached Holbeach, he knew roughly how many men remained inside and how lightly they were armed. The siege was brief and one-sided. Walsh's men surrounded the house and opened fire. The Wright brothers, John and Christopher, were among the first to fall, shot down as they defended the courtyard. John Wright, who had been reputed one of the finest swordsmen in England, died with a musket ball through his body before he could close the distance to use his blade. Ambrose Rookwood, already weakened by his burns from the gunpowder accident, was struck and captured alive. Catesby and Percy made their last stand together in the courtyard of Holbeach House. According to the account that circulated afterwards, the two men were shot by a single marksman, a soldier named John Street of the Worcestershire trained bands, whose musket ball passed through Catesby and struck Percy behind him. Whether this account is strictly accurate or was embellished in the retelling is uncertain, but both men fell mortally wounded within moments of each other. Catesby, according to witnesses, managed to drag himself back inside the house after being shot. He found a painting of the Virgin Mary, an image of the faith for which he had risked and lost everything, and died clutching it to his chest. Percy lingered for some hours in agony before dying of his wounds without making any confession or final statement. Thomas Winter was shot through the right shoulder as he crossed a courtyard and was captured alive, bleeding heavily. His sword arm was useless, and he offered no further resistance. He would survive to stand trial. The siege at Holbeach House effectively ended the Gunpowder Plot as an active conspiracy. The principal architect of the scheme was dead, along with several of his closest allies. Their bodies were treated with deliberate contempt. Catesby and Percy were later exhumed and decapitated, their heads displayed on spikes outside the House of Lords as a warning to others who might contemplate treason. The surviving conspirators were rounded up over the following days and weeks. Sir Everard Digby, who had fled from Dunchurch on the night Catesby arrived with news of the plot's failure, was captured within days, found hiding in a dry ditch near the town. Robert Keyes was taken shortly afterwards, discovered sheltering with a Catholic family in Warwickshire. Francis Tresham was arrested in London on November the 12th. He was imprisoned in the Tower, where he fell gravely ill, possibly from a urinary infection, and died on December the 23rd, 1605, before he could be brought to trial. On his deathbed, Tresham reportedly denied writing the Monteagle letter one final time. His death deprived the government of the chance to interrogate him publicly about it, and the question of his authorship went unanswered. By the end of November, the government had every surviving conspirator in custody. The cells of the Tower of London held Thomas Winter, Guy Fawkes, Robert Keyes, Ambrose Rookwood, John Grant, Robert Winter, Thomas Bates, and Sir Everard Digby. Each man was interrogated at length. Their confessions, taken down by Cecil's clerks, filled pages with the details of how the plot had been conceived, funded, and nearly executed. They awaited trial for the highest crime in English law, and they knew what the verdict would be. Part 5. Trial, Execution and Memory. The trial of the surviving conspirators opened on Monday, January the 27th, 1606, in Westminster Hall, the same medieval hall that stood yards from the chamber they had planned to destroy. The 8 defendants were brought from the Tower by barge along the Thames and led through crowds that had gathered to see the men who had tried to murder the king and blow up Parliament. The prisoners were held in the Star Chamber overnight before being brought into the hall the following morning. Westminster Hall was packed. The government had arranged the trial as a public spectacle, a demonstration of royal justice and a warning to anyone who might harbour similar ambitions. The Commission of Judges was headed by Sir John Popham, the Lord Chief Justice, a formidable legal mind who had presided over the trials of Walter Raleigh and the Earl of Essex. Beside him sat the Earls of Suffolk, Worcester, Northampton and Salisbury, the last of these being Robert Cecil himself, now elevated to the peerage. Cecil had choreographed much of the prosecution and had personally overseen the gathering of confessions and evidence. The defendants stood together at the bar: Sir Everard Digby, Robert Winter, John Grant, Thomas Bates, Thomas Winter, Guy Fawkes, Ambrose Rookwood and Robert Keyes. Several of them bore visible marks of their ordeal. Fawkes was gaunt and broken, barely able to stand after weeks of torture. Grant's face was disfigured from the gunpowder burns at Holbeach. Thomas Winter's right arm hung useless from his gunshot wound. The case of the prosecution was led by Sir Edward Coke, the Attorney General, one of the most formidable lawyers in English history. Coke was a man of ferocious intellect and equally ferocious temperament, known for his bullying manner in court and his mastery of legal precedent. He opened with a lengthy speech that placed the Gunpowder Plot in the context of Catholic treachery stretching back decades, linking the conspirators to the Jesuits and to Rome. Coke's speech was as much political theatre as legal argument. He described the planned explosion in graphic terms, dwelling on the destruction that would have been wrought on the assembled lords, bishops, judges, and the royal family. He called the plot the most barbarous and detestable conspiracy that had ever been conceived in the heart of man. The evidence against the defendants was overwhelming. Their own confessions, extracted in the Tower over the preceding weeks, were read aloud in court. Thomas Winter's confession was particularly detailed, running to several pages and describing the genesis of the plot from Catesby's first approach through to the final days. Fawkes's confession corroborated the account in every material particular. The defendants had little room to mount a defense. The facts were admitted. The gunpowder had been found. The confessions had been signed. Most of the defendants pleaded not guilty, a formality that allowed the evidence to be presented in full, though the outcome was never in doubt. Ambrose Rookwood attempted a partial defense, arguing that he had been drawn in by his devotion to Catesby and had joined the conspiracy late, without fully understanding its scope until it was too late to withdraw. He spoke of Catesby's persuasive power, describing it in terms that suggested he had been unable to resist the man's force of personality. The court was unmoved. The exception to the not guilty pleas was Sir Everard Digby. Digby pleaded guilty and addressed the court directly. He was the youngest and wealthiest of the conspirators, a man who had been knighted by James less than 3 years before and who had enjoyed the king's personal favour. He spoke of his loyalty to Catesby, of his belief in the Catholic cause, and of the broken promises James had made to the Catholic community. He appealed to the court to show mercy to his wife, Mary, and their 2 young sons, Kenelm and John, who he said were innocent of any involvement. He asked that his estates be preserved for his children rather than forfeited to the crown. Coke dismissed Digby's plea with contempt, telling him that his sons would be taught to curse the memory of their father. The exchange was one of the few moments in the trial where a human voice broke through the machinery of state prosecution. Robert Keyes offered a different kind of response. When the guilty verdict was delivered, Keyes reportedly declared that his case was beyond argument and that he had come there to die. He showed no remorse and asked for none. The verdict was unanimous and took little time to reach. All 8 defendants were found guilty of high treason. The sentence was the standard punishment prescribed by law. Each man was to be drawn on a hurdle through the streets of London to the place of execution, hanged by the neck until partially strangled, cut down while still alive, and then castrated, disemboweled and quartered, with his remains displayed publicly as a warning. The executions were carried out over 2 days at the end of January 1606. On the 30th, Digby, Robert Winter, Grant and Bates were drawn on hurdles from the Tower to the churchyard of St. Paul's Cathedral. Digby was the first to mount the scaffold. He reportedly said that he died for his faith and that he prayed for the king. When the executioner cut open his chest and held up his heart with the traditional cry of, "Behold the heart of a traitor," Digby was said by some witnesses to have murmured the words, "Thou liest." Whether this account is accurate or apocryphal, it became one of the most enduring details of the Gunpowder Plot's aftermath. Robert Winter, Grant and Bates followed. Bates, as a commoner and a servant, attracted less attention from the crowd than the gentleman who preceded him, but he died the same death. The following day, January the 31st, Thomas Winter, Rookwood, Keyes and Fawkes were drawn from the Tower to the old palace yard at Westminster, within sight of the building they had planned to destroy. Keyes mounted the scaffold with a kind of grim determination, and when the moment came, he jumped from the ladder before the hangman was ready, attempting to break his own neck and spare himself the agony of the disemboweling that would follow. The rope broke under the force of his fall, and he was taken up alive and subjected to the full sentence. Guy Fawkes was the last to die. He was so weakened by his weeks of torture that he had to be helped up the ladder to the scaffold. When he reached the top, he addressed the small crowd that remained, asking forgiveness of the king and the state. Then, whether by design or because his broken body simply gave way, he jumped or fell from the ladder with the noose around his neck, and the drop broke his neck, killing him before the executioner could cut him down for the remainder of the sentence. It was a small mercy in a day of calculated brutality. The government's pursuit of those connected to the plot extended well beyond the 13 conspirators themselves. In the weeks after the executions, Cecil's agents swept through the Catholic Midlands, arresting anyone suspected of having given shelter, money, or encouragement to the plotters. Several Catholic gentlemen who had no direct involvement in the conspiracy found themselves in prison on charges of harbouring or failing to report what they knew. The most significant arrest was that of Father Henry Garnet, the superior of the Jesuit order in England. Garnet was taken in late January 1606. He had been found hiding in one of Nicholas Owen's priest holes at Hindlip Hall in Worcestershire, concealed behind a false chimney, along with another priest, Father Edward Oldcorn, after a search of the house that lasted 4 days. The two men had survived in the cramped hiding space with minimal food and water and emerged in a state of physical collapse when they were finally discovered. Garnet maintained that he had learned of the plot only through the seal of confession, a sacred confidence that Catholic doctrine forbade him from breaking. He said that he had tried to dissuade the plotters through intermediaries and had urged Catesby to abandon the scheme, but that he could not have reported it to the authorities without violating the sacrament. The government rejected this defense entirely. Garnet was tried, found guilty of treason, and hanged on May 3, 1606, outside St. Paul's Cathedral. His execution was controversial, even among Protestants, and the crowd, unusually, was said to have remained largely silent as he died. The political consequences of the Gunpowder Plot fell on the entire English Catholic community, including the many thousands who had played no part in the conspiracy and who had been as horrified by it as their Protestant neighbours. In the months following the trial, Parliament passed the Popish Recusants Act of 1606, the harshest anti-Catholic legislation yet seen in England. Catholics were barred from practising law, serving as officers in the army or navy, or acting as guardians to children. They were required to take an oath of allegiance that specifically repudiated the Pope's authority to depose monarchs, an oath that many Catholics regarded as incompatible with their faith. Those who refused could have 2/3 of their estates seized. The Act also prohibited Catholics from living within 10 miles of London, restricted their ability to travel without licence, and empowered local authorities to search Catholic homes for weapons and religious objects at will. Catholic worship was driven further underground, and the community entered a period of marginalisation that would last, in legal terms, for more than 2 centuries. The very outcome that the plotters had sought to prevent, the tightening of the laws against Catholics, had been accelerated by their actions. Full Catholic emancipation would come only in 1829, more than 220 years after Guy Fawkes was pulled from the cellar beneath the House of Lords. The most visible legacy of the plot was the annual commemoration of November 5 itself. Within weeks of the conspirators' execution, Parliament passed the observance of 5th November Act, establishing the date as a day of public thanksgiving for the King's deliverance. Churches across England held special services, and bonfires were lit in towns and villages throughout the country. Over the decades and centuries that followed, the religious character of the celebration faded, and the festive character grew. Effigies were burned, fireworks were set off, and children collected pennies with the cry of, "A penny for the Guy!" The figure of Guy Fawkes, the soldier caught in the cellar with his slow matches, became the enduring symbol of the plot, eclipsing Catesby, who had conceived and led it, in the public imagination. The reasons for this are partly accidental. Fawkes was the man who was caught, the man whose face became known, the man whose interrogation and execution were most public. Catesby died at Holbeach House and never stood trial. His story ended in a Staffordshire courtyard, while Fawkes's played out on the scaffold at Westminster in front of a crowd. History remembered the man in the cellar, not the man who sent him there. Robert Catesby had conceived the Gunpowder Plot as an act of liberation for his persecuted community. He had recruited men of conviction, secured the materials, placed the gunpowder beneath the seat of English power, and come within hours of detonating it. The conspiracy failed because of a single anonymous letter, and the identity of its author remains uncertain to this day. What is certain is that the plot achieved the opposite of everything Catesby intended. The Catholic community he sought to free was subjected to harsher persecution than ever before, and the memory of what he planned was used to justify that persecution for generations. The bonfires that burn across England on the 5th of November each year began as celebrations of Protestant deliverance from Catholic treachery. That the man whose effigy sits atop them has since become a symbol of anti-establishment rebellion is an irony that none of the 13 conspirators could have foreseen. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.